Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 342. Dayenu, That's Enough Climate Change. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And before we jump into our conversation for today, just a reminder that if you have been waiting to sign up for the Anyeshiva mini courses that we are offering over the next few weeks in the lead up to the high holidays, if you have been waiting for the last minute has arrived. In fact, one of the classes, How to Be a Chavruta, starts on Sunday. So if you want to register for that, you should register really soon. The rest of the classes start on Wednesday and Thursday. So if you want to register for those, you should register very soon, but you still have a few days. Head over to judaismunbound.com/classes, and you can check out the 5 classes that we are offering in the month of Elul that are leading up to the high holidays. The month of Elul is the month that comes before the new year. And these are 5 really interesting classes, all of which are in some ways connected to the lead up to the high holidays and putting us in the mindset of the things that maybe we ought to be thinking about as we think about a new year beginning. There is a sliding scale payment approach and also an opportunity to apply for financial aid if you need assistance beyond that. We don't want ability to pay to be a barrier to taking these classes, and we invite you and we're excited to have you join us for these classes in the lead up to the high holidays. And now let's turn our attention to today's conversation. You know, we've been talking about Shemitah all year long, the 7-year cycles of the Jewish calendar. Now, as we head towards the end of the Shemitah year and start to think about another important question, which we opened last week with Nigel Savage, which is after the Shemitah year, how do we go into the next 6 years? We think that making care for the earth, the climate, a more prominent part of Jewish ideas and Jewish practice for the years ahead and forevermore is a really critical thing that we ought to be thinking about. And so while our guest today and the organization that she represents don't necessarily put their work in the frame of Shemitah that much, we think it very much does belong there in the way that we have been thinking about Shemitah, and we're excited to open up that avenue for thinking with our guest today, Jennie Rosenn. She is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. Dayenu is a relatively new organization that's grown rapidly. It's now up to 100 Dayenu circles, which are affiliated with synagogues, hillels, other Jewish organizations, and even neighborhoods across the country. Dayenu played a role in getting the Inflation Reduction Act, a major piece of legislation that includes a lot of climate-related legislation. They played a role in getting that over the finish line recently. And in just a few days from now, on September 7th, they'll be launching a new nonpartisan Get Out the Vote campaign called Chutzpah 2022. Well, they'll be reaching out to Jewish and climate voters in key states ahead of the 2022 midterms to ensure that they know what's at stake. Prior to founding Dayenu, Jennie Rosenn spent more than 2 decades leading Jewish nonprofit organizations, advocating for social change, and working on projects at the heart of the Jewish social justice movement, including serving as vice president of community engagement at HIAS and as the director of the Jewish Life and Values program at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, where she built the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable and the Sela Leadership Training Program. Jennie Rosenn was a founding board member of Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps, and of Repair the World. And she has also served on the boards of the Jewish Funders Network and New York Jobs with Justice. Jennie Rosenn has rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion of the Reform Movement, and she has twice been named to the Forward newspaper's annual list of the 50 most influential Jews in America. So, Jennie Rosenn, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Great to be here.
Well, I'm going to start with what I call a Lex question, because this tends to be the thing that Lex is interested in. But when I was thinking about Dayenu...
You're stealing it?
I'm stealing it because, you know, we generally would start with a question like, tell us about Dayenu and what it's all about, which is basically the opening question. But specifically in terms of why it's called Dayenu. Like Lex and I have talked about these naming conventions of Jewish organizations, and often it's like a really boring English word and then translated into a Hebrew word, so it sounds less boring. So you would think like maybe Dayenu would have been called Aklim or something like that, which means climate in Hebrew. But it's Dayenu, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with the climate. So could you explain why it's called Dayenu and what it does?
Absolutely. And that was on the, we had lots of butcher block paper in the naming process, and that had many of those names you're referring to. So as I think some folks listening know, Dayenu is a joyous song, right? It's a song of gratitude that we sing at the Passover Seder each year when we retell the story of the Jewish people's journey from slavery to freedom. And we recount all the things that God has done for us, right? We say, if God had taken us out of Egypt, but not given us the Torah, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If God had given us the Torah, but not brought us to Israel, Dayenu, it would have been enough, and so on. And it usually is understood as it would have been enough. But it also means we've had enough. We've had enough destruction. We've had enough valuing fossil fuel companies over human life. We've had enough letting the impacts of climate destruction fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, marginalized communities. Dayenu. But here's also where the double entendre comes in. It can also mean we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the resources and the policy rubrics and the technology. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. So we named Dayenu really to capture both of these sentiments of hope and enoughness and the sentiment of great urgency. Our mission is to mobilize the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. Dayenu comes really at the intersection of the secular climate movement, the Jewish social justice movement, the multi-faith climate movement, and the Jewish environmental movement. We launched in those early days of the pandemic around a just green recovery. How are we going to recover, and how are we going to build a future that addresses the climate crisis and begins to usher in and build a new way of living that will bring about a just and equitable and livable and sustainable future? And we have worked both through building a network of Dayenu circles across the country. There are more than 100 in formations across the country, partnering with Jewish organizations, training up lots of young activists, providing resources and training to Dayenu circles, who then have been engaging in our campaigns. So we've designed strategic campaigns from early on urging then presidential candidate Joe Biden to champion a bold climate platform, which he did. We mobilized nearly 1,000 volunteers leading up to the 2020 election. They reached out to more than 750,000 climate voters through Chutzpah 2020. We called and emailed and met with dozens of members of Congress to urge the passage of climate legislation. Here, the call campaign in the fall, we showed up with shofars and prayer and song at 16 senators' offices, urging them to go big and bold on climate, giving them chizuk, giving them strength and encouragement to pass a budget reconciliation bill. And then most recently this spring, we organized faith leaders from all different traditions with climate movement partners to ensure our moral call resounded clearly and loudly in the halls of power, to ensure that the folks who were going to help bring this bill across the finish line were able to do so.
I've been struck as I surfed around your website with all these little shout outs to whether it's Hebrew phrases or Jewish texts that could just float on by. But it's not that you're hammering people with like, oh, here's Jewish liturgy left and right and you must know about it. But little things like with all our might in English, which is, of course, an excerpt from the Shema, from the prayer where you say, like, love God with all your might. But in this context, it's not necessarily being channeled towards loving God with all your might. It's towards fighting for climate justice with all your might. And me seeing that, I don't spend a lot of time sitting there, but I just have a moment of, oh, yeah, that's kind of cool to redirect this thing that's traditionally about God worship, which, depending on the day, I'm more or less into something that every day I am really, and by the way, some days really into it, but every day I'm really into fighting for climate justice. So I guess I'd love to hear a little more about, I guess, I mean, you've given a really incredible initial window into the work you've been up to recently, but the work you've been doing to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, I'd love to hear a little more about that. Like, what does it look like to really be doing that work on the ground to move policymakers through a Jewish lens? And I guess on that Jewish lens front, whether it's talking about this All Our Might piece specifically or any other pieces of your work that tie to, textual tradition or Jewish stories or whatever, how do you go about weaving that together? I mean, I mentioned how All Our Might is traditionally associated with God, and now you're channeling it into climate change. That's kind of a pattern that I think you embrace as an organization. So what are some examples? How does that manifest?
We've really been working tirelessly to pass this first ever piece of comprehensive federal climate legislation, which very auspiciously was first passed on Tisha B'Av and then actually brought home on Tu B'Av, the holiday of love.
And with that obvious climate name, the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes, exactly. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act, which really is the largest single investment ever in the United States in clean energy transportation and energy efficiency. The Jewish climate movement worked in a whole lot of different ways to bring us to this moment, to contribute to this. We were a small part of an enormous amount of efforts. And I should say that these efforts really have been led in no small part by Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And we have been joining Jewish, multi-faith, secular partners, really millions of climate concerned people to show up with all our people, with all our power, with all our spirit. We also know that there's some deeply troubling provisions in this bill, which in many ways favor powerful fossil fuel industry, which causes tremendous harm, most notably the expansion of oil and gas development. And so there are also efforts to try to keep the bad pieces from happening. And at the same time, this bill offers hope for a different kind of world, one that gives future generations a fighting chance at survival. So this actually brings us to your other question about the All Our Might campaign, because the era of fossil fuels is not over, and federal legislation is one piece of what we need. The other piece is that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and unburned. The fossil fuel industry still has our government and economy in its grip, which is part of why this Passover, we mobilized over 1,000 Jews and allies to rally outside 21 bank branches and asset managers, demanding that they move their dough. This was Passover actions, and there was a lot of matzah around the urgency of this moment to move their dough out of fossil fuels and invest in the clean energy future that we need. You mentioned, Lex, that this is based, the name All Our Might, in the Via Havta, in the passage of the Shema prayer, where we talk about loving God with all our heart and all our soul and all our might. So the All Our Might campaign is working with Jewish partners and secular partners and other faith partners to remove the financial support and the social license of the fossil fuel industry by urging banks and asset managers and Jewish institutions to be a force for good and to leave behind fossil fuel investments and invest in a just, clean energy future. And like the Via Havta, All Our Might is rooted in love, right? Love for our planet, love for our communities, love for generations to come. If we're going to avert the most harmful impacts of the climate crisis, if we're going to be able to live Lador Vador, generation to generation, if we're going to be able to do this, we need to not only invest in clean energy solutions, which we absolutely need to do, but we also need to be slashing emissions. And this includes stopping the drilling and mining and burning of gas and coal and oil. So the All Our Might campaign really has three pillars. The first is pressuring banks and asset managers to move their money out of fossil fuel and into clean energy. The second is around the Jewish community. How can we align our institutional resources with our values? How can we move the Jewish community's money out of fossil fuel and into clean energy? And here our approach is really one of support, not adversarial. How do we support Jewish foundations and the movements and federations who want to align their investments with their values to do that. And then the third is, how do we stand as allies with communities on the front lines who not only are feeling the impacts disproportionately of the climate crisis, but for whom there is fossil fuel infrastructure right in their backyards and on indigenous lands, often literally in their backyards. I will add, for those who are interested in sort of rabbinic minutia, one of the interpretations in the Shema of B'chol Ma'odecha, with all our might, is that it actually is a play on a word for resources or money. So there's, again, a sort of double entendre of calling the campaign All Our Might to be rooted in love, to bring all our heart and soul and might, and tactically has a lot to do with where we put our resources, where we put our money.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. When I daven, when I, do the liturgical prayers, I actually have a personal practice where I kind of like act out. I like do motions with my body in the Shema related to each of the things that it mentions. And so like all my heart, I like put my hand on my heart, all my soul. I never really know what to do with that because I don't know what a soul is exactly. But all my might, or all my oomph, I sometimes translate. Like I put my hand on my pocket where my wallet is, precisely because of that interpretation that you just cited. So anyway, I have another Shema question, which is about a part of the Shema that I think a lot of folks are much less familiar with. The second paragraph of the Shema, I did not grow up saying it, but I actually think that it ties very directly to work for climate justice. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of different ways to interpret it, but suffice to say, it's talking about God's relationship to Israel, and that's not really where I'm taking it, but it's saying that if people sort of follow commitments they've made, in this case to God, if they're ethical in various ways that God conceptualized ethics in the book of Deuteronomy, then the rain will come and the earth will be good to go. And if we're not, then this text claims that the earth will suffer, basically. And so you can see really directly there. And actually, a friend of mine, friend of the show, Kat Zavis, has created a beautiful translation of that second paragraph that ties it directly to contemporary questions of greed and corporate greed specifically, and how it takes us away from our commitments to the earth and how it does, in fact, lead to the suffering of the earth. But I'm curious, like, do you have any hidden takes about that other part of the Shema? I know you don't have an initiative that is necessarily built directly on it, but how do you understand that paragraph? Does it tie into ways in which Dayenu is fighting against continuing to take those fossil fuels out of the earth versus the commitments that would actually help us have a fighting chance of survival?
Wow. That is such a beautiful question. And I actually want to encourage folks to check out Dayenu's Climate Torah. We have a set of resources on our website, and one of them is around this very question of climate as a language of covenant. Most human beings around the world feel the effects of climate change right now, either as too much or too little rain, right? That's already a way that we're really experiencing this. And this question about the importance of right rain at the right time is very familiar to us. And Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belser writes about how when the Israelites were coming out of the desert into the land that they'd been promised, their loyalty and fidelity to God will ensure the abundance of earth and the fluid, she writes, in the fluid generosity of the heavens, right? So this is from the book of Deuteronomy that figures rain as God's gift to the land. And this is very similar to this concept that's addressed, as you said, in the second paragraph of the Shema. And while it's troubling to modern people to think about it in this way as like a kind of instantaneous or causal effect, the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic texts almost always view drought not as like an arbitrary event, but as a sign that we've strayed from covenant. That's to say that when disaster strikes, it's not because God has abandoned us, but rather that we've somehow left the way of God. I was thinking about the line that we say in the Amidah, in the sort of central prayer, and we change it a little bit during the 10 days of repentance, during those 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And there's a line that we add we say, Zochrenu l'chaim melech chafetz b'chaim, chovenu b'sefer chaim, l'ma'ancha Elohim chaim, right? Remember us for life, sovereign who desires life. Inscribe us in the book of life for your sake, O God. So you hear the word chaim, life, repeated 4 times. And I recently heard Rabbi Deborah Sachs-Mintz talk about how in this we vacillate between humility and chutzpah. Remember us for life. And then we remind God, sovereign who desires life. And then we say, inscribe us in the book of life. And then we say, for your sake, O living God. So you can hear that vacillation between humility and chutzpah. What I've been thinking about recently is that God doesn't want us to destroy humanity. And at the same time, it really comes back to us. You were talking about names before and how we named Dayenu. And one of the early names that we didn't go with, but it was Dayenu, in our hands. With, again, that double entendre of it's in our hands.
It's the same letters. Yadenu and Dayenu. That's incredible. It's in Hebrew, it's the same letters.
It's the same letters. But again, that double entendre of it's on us and it's in our hands. We can do this. We got this. We need to be bold enough to not just patchki. Yes, we need to do all sorts of individual practices, but we also need to be bold enough to envision a really different way forward. Not just to stop the bad stuff, but what are we building? How do we build a just green energy economy? How do we build a livable future where all people can have enough for generations to come? One of the core teachings of climate Torah for Dayenu is this idea of it not being up to God exclusively. Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heavens. And this, again, going back to the Exodus from Egypt, when the Jews are freed from Egypt and when we're wandering in the desert, God reminds us that the path forward and our redemption is not in the heavens or beyond our reach, right? God says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in the heavens. It's not too baffling for you or beyond your reach. It's not in the heavens. It's not beyond the sea. God says, no, it's really close to you. It's in your heart, or actually in your mouth and in your heart to do it. And then God actually goes on and says, to make it even clearer just how high the stakes are, God goes on and says, I set before you this day, life and prosperity, death and adversity. I've put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life so that you and your offspring will live. It's in our hands and in our hearts, and we can do it. With such a kind of existential, right? The climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time. And it is so freaking overwhelming to really take that in, to take in the magnitude. I think, are my children going to have enough food to eat? Are they going to have clean air to breathe and water to drink, let alone my grandchildren? It's so easy to tune it out, to opt out, to close our eyes, to cover our ears. And part of what's upon us is to make space to take that in and then to remember, Lo b'shamayim hi, we have tremendous both responsibility and possibility in our response.
And when the rabbis faced a profoundly different Jewish reality, they actually used that line, it's not in the heavens, right, to sort of take power from God and to say, well, now it's up to us, right? That even if God self would come and tell us that the law should be one way, we don't have to do that if the majority disagrees, and
right.
Somebody actually was just on Twitter, Maimonides Nuts has been posting ways that different Jewish stories work. And then somebody responded to a version like this saying, the classic version of that Jewish story is that it's 9 rabbis against 1 rabbi. And then the voice of God comes down and says the law should be, the way of the one person. And so the other guy turns to the one holdout and says, oh, come on, now it's 9 against 2. I mean, you still should be on our side. But I actually wanted to take some of the ideas that you're talking about even further, because I want to talk later about the strategy of movement building. But at this stage, I want to talk about the strategy of idea building, of theology building, right? Of some sense of where does this impulse come from? Why should the Jewish community organize itself to be the leading community fighting for climate justice, et cetera, right? And it feels to me like we need to have a really strong and compelling statement of how absolutely this is what Judaism's been all about from the very beginning. This is what it's been leading to. And it feels to me like a part of that is if many Jews are not going to specifically embrace the idea that God wants this or God wants that, they would say, right, I don't know that God wants anything, right? I don't think of God as a being with a will, et cetera, that we have to find a way to use some of these ideas in a powerful, metaphorical way that will really speak to people. And I'm wondering whether, part of that is on the agenda. Like when you were talking about the idea in the Shema about, if we don't fulfill the covenant, then rain will be withheld, et cetera, right? It feels to me like there's an opportunity to really powerfully say, and that statement from a certain time in our past actually is about the fact that if we do not steward the earth, it turns out that rain will be withheld. It's not a punishment. It's actually a description of the reality of how science works, right? And it feels to me like if we can take some of these ideas that we have from Jewish texts and from other parts of Judaism and interpret them in a really powerful way for Jews who may not be, see themselves as believers, and also ultimately for non-Jews, right? So how do we kind of translate all this in a powerful ideas way, drawing on Jewish ideas to really sort of build a movement with a sense of moral duty?
The Jewish community is not leading the climate movement, nor should we. The climate movement is led primarily by Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor communities who are feeling the disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis already. The climate crisis is here. Climate impacts are here. The best analogy, I think, to the fact that it affects all of us, but not all of us equally, is COVID. We're all susceptible to COVID, but COVID has not impacted the world or the nation with equality. And the same thing is true with the climate crisis. So disproportionately impacts marginalized and poor and communities that have been traditionally discriminated against. And that is happening right now. The second piece I want to challenge is that it's not either the responsibility, the privilege, the honor, the chutzpah of the Jewish community to lead the climate movement. The question is, how do we all, in the words of one of my colleagues, go get our people? This is an all hands on deck moment. So we are a contributor. We are 2% of the population. We also have impact and influence on culture and politics and ideas in this country in particular. The question is, how are we bringing our people and power to this larger movement? I think the role for religious voices in general is critical. This is a moral issue. The question of what values we center, are those going to be the value of justice? Is that going to be around the common good? Is that going to be, or is it going to be kowtowing to, special interests? Those can be very powerful religious questions. A second piece that the Jewish community has to bring is our own history and experience. We are not the only people to have faced oppression or destruction or disruption by any stretch of the imagination, but that is part of our history. And each time we've not just survived, but we've envisioned and rebuilt a different kind of future, right? Each time we've had to create a new kind of existence. And the quintessential story of this, of course, is the ancient temple and the destruction of the ancient temple. We just observed Tisha B'Av. And this is a story of radical transformation, right? The destruction of the temple wasn't just about a building. It was the end of the sacrificial system and the birth of rabbinic Judaism, right? It's really a powerful example of a complete paradigmatic and societal transformation. Not the same structures, just like we should not be rebuilding the same structures now, but ones that really transformed Jewish civilization into a new era. And we can all think of many times throughout history where there was this profound reinvention. That's the moment we're in now. We need bold change, not incremental actions. The third way that I think what we have to bring to the movement is this idea of building a spiritually rooted climate movement. The power of what it means to bring tradition and teaching and spirit and song. We've been developing a lot of new Jewish climate music that really grounds not only historically, but now in our own experience. How are we kind of fueling and sustaining a movement for the long haul. 80% of American Jews are concerned about the climate crisis, or very concerned. And this is a statistic from several years ago. My guess is it's much higher at this point. It was found to be, in two different recent studies, the number one issue among Jewish voters. And yet, Dayenu came into existence because most American Jews were not engaged in the climate crisis in a systemic way. They may have been changing their personal practices, but they were not mobilizing communally political power for systemic change. I think there are two reasons for that. One is people aren't sure what to do. How do I actually make meaningful change? And the second is the spiritual, existential, emotional weight of it. How do you not just shut down and take care of your family and your to-do lists and watch Netflix and tune out and do what you need to do? How do you make space for that? And so Dayenu has also been developing a series of workshops, which we found to be particularly resonant with young adults, although we've also been bringing it to many of our Dayenu circles, grassroots groups around the country engaging on climate. How do we create space for that grief and anxiety and fear? And how do we do that rooted in our tradition with Jewish texts and music and Jewish community? Because ultimately, this is about not being alone. This is about taking action collectively in community. So I think building spiritual resources for the Jewish climate movement also has a role to play in some of what we can offer to the larger climate movement.
So I don't think this is a huge gear shift. I want to talk about chutzpah. We're talking about different words. We talked about Dayenu at the beginning, but it's not just a word. It's an initiative of yours also. We've been having a little bit of a chutzpah moment on Judaism Unbound in the sense that we've been revisiting some ongoing themes of our podcast. And chutzpah, the call for people to really be, more radical, more stretch themselves Jewishly, to think outside the boundaries of the prayer books and the synagogue buildings and the existing institutions we've inherited. We've been pushing people to think about what it would look like to really foster, create, invent forms of Judaism that are chutzpahdik, which is, the adjective of chutzpah, chutzpah-ish. Your organization has a deep relationship to chutzpah. You mentioned that it's a multi-year relationship at this point. You had chutzpah 2020. Why did you choose that notion of chutzpah to be such a central piece of your work? And what is that piece? What is your chutzpah initiative?
So we are in a moment where we all need to cultivate tremendous chutzpah. And I think it is related to two other things we talk about. One is courage, and the other is spiritual audacity. The scientists tell us we have 7 years to get on track to avert the worst of climate disaster, which lines up with Shemitah rather auspiciously.
It does.
How do we cultivate the courage to really let that in? How do we cultivate the courage and the spiritual audacity and have the chutzpah to take actions that are outside our comfort zone? I mentioned the 16 Hear the Call actions that happened across the country in the fall and the 21 Passover actions that happened across the country this spring around Passover. And most of those activists had not taken public actions before. These are people who Dayenu trained and offered resources and a campaign to connect to, but there was chutzpah and spiritual audacity and courage to be able to step out of their own comfort zone and to have the chutzpah to know that we have more power than we think, that we need to challenge the way things are, as you were saying, to imagine new ways of being, to imagine the world we need to create, the new economy, the new systems, the new practices, the new sources of energy, the new ways of conducting business to be more just and sustainable. And then we need the courage to stay in the work. Noah, our ancestor, did not save the world. He took his family, got on a boat, took a few animals. So often he's referred to in the context of climate. Actually, he's, I think, a terrible example.
I'm going to send you my bar mitzvah speech because I strongly agree, and so did 13-year-old Lex, but keep going.
Oh, I look forward to that. Kedushot Levi, who's a commentator, actually challenges this. Maybe you referred to him in your bar mitzvah, your teaching, right? Because there's this whole debate about whether he was a righteous man. Here he had the power to save humanity from the flood, and he didn't act. So why? According to Kiddushat Levi, it was because he writes, Hayakatan ve'enav ma'od. He was very small in his own eyes. He saw himself as too small. I think about this a lot because on the one hand, we often have this like outsized sense of ourselves. We have this sense of dominion over things. That's part of how we got here. That's part of how we found ourselves in the climate crisis. And yet so often, too often, I think we also have a small sense of ourselves. We like retreat in the face of a very complex, or what some people call like a wicked problem. And we succumb to feeling overwhelmed, and we don't engage in things that are big, like climate change, at the scale they require. So, and of course, Noach is contrasted with other leaders like Abraham, who really faced destruction of humanity with courage, with chutzpah. Part of what we're being called in this moment is not to see ourselves as small, but to really understand our power and to have the chutzpah to act on that power. In a very specific sense, chutzpah 2020 and now chutzpah 2022 is Dayenu's nonpartisan get out the vote effort that targets Jewish, climate concerned, and low propensity voters in some key states. And so to accelerate change, we really need to elevate the climate crisis in elections, and we need to educate elected officials and candidates about what's at stake. So we're launching Chutzpah 2022 to call and knock on the doors of 400,000 Jewish and infrequent climate-concerned voters in key states. And our goal is to elevate climate as an electoral issue and also ensure that the media and candidates see climate as a top issue for Jewish communities and donors and voters, which it is. The challenge for Dayenu and for the Jewish climate movement, and frankly, for the climate movement in America more broadly, I don't believe is to convert those on the fringes. And it really is the fringes who are climate deniers. They get a lot of airtime, but they're a very small percentage of folks. The challenge is, how do we move people from angst to action? And that's the question. How do we really move people, you might say, off the couch and into the streets? And there's a role for everyone.
Could I kind of like double dog, triple chutzpah you on this? Because I'm thinking about like chutzpah 2023, because I'll grant you this midterm election. But if we only have 7 years before a climate disaster, becomes inevitable, then I kind of feel like, okay, so we really are in this position of Noah in the story. And it's like, we don't have 7 years to get ourselves off the couch because by that time, we don't have time to actually act. So it feels to me like we have a couple of years to really get everybody off the couch and, getting action into place that has a chance of being implemented within this 7-year period. So I guess I'm wondering, just within the Jewish community right now, just talking within the Jewish community, I would say that like any rabbi who is not, giving sermons about this should be fired, right? Every day school that is not putting climate stuff at the very front of their education should be excommunicated. I mean, what I'm saying is that if we're really serious about this, like, how do we get the message into the machinery of the Jewish community, not just the organizations devoted to climate change, working sort of retail to try to get people off their couches, but how do we leverage the intermediaries in Jewish life who, it really feels to me like the dance band on the Titanic. It's like, well, if the Earth is about to go out of existence, or human life as we know it, then what difference does Judaism make in any way, shape, or form? What is the dream, I guess, is a way of what I'm asking. Like, what if the Jewish community were really doing what Dayenu thinks it ought to be doing, and not just in the sort of, I totally understand running a nonprofit organization myself, that there's a limitation to what you can actually do or even dream about in any given moment because there are limited resources. But if we really wanted to say, hey, this is what the Jewish community needs to look like a couple of years from now in order to really have a chance of it kind of intervening in the right way, what would that have to look like?
Well, first, I want to affirm, you didn't exactly say this, but I would say that this is the ultimate Jewish continuity issue, right? The Jewish community is obsessed with continuity. I remember the 1991 Jewish population study, which began an era of obsession with continuity.
I entered the world in '90, so I like to take credit for that.
You were part of that
No,
Jewish continuity agenda.
I spent my life. I spent my life. I emerged, and then I decided to make a life fighting against that agenda.
Well, you
Good
were
times.
part of the answer to the study. You were part of the continuity that then came.
Yes.
This is the ultimate continuity issue. This also, I would say, is the ultimate multi-generational issue. What it would mean is that Jews individually, Jewish communities locally, and Jewish institutions, and I really want to kind of make a distinction between those three, were bringing all of their people and power and resources and people power to the crisis, and doing so addressing the systemic levers for change: policy, electoral work, movement building, mobilization, and fossil fuel finance and keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Listen, I think it would be great for rabbis to talk about climate crisis, but it needs to be partnered with an understanding that that's where community power and resources is going to be oriented. Bill McKibben, one of the many wonderful things he has said, is we're past the point where we can confront the climate crisis one vegan meal at a time. This is not about buying our way out of this. It's not about what car we drive. It's what cars does Detroit make. That means that we need to be, in his words, less of an individual and join movements that are sharp enough to make change. So this needs to be about the Jewish community putting its people and power behind collective systemic change. There are lots of opportunities to do that. And part of what Dayenu is seeking to do is not just on a retail basis, Jew by Jew, but also organization by organization and community by community, and bringing our power in partnership with other communities, not in a silo, right? Too often we sort of think that, we have to kind of do things, the Jews off to the side. How do we actually bring our power to the larger climate movement?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I'm flashing to, I actually forget whether Dan brought this up first or I brought this up first, but one of us or both proposed that it would be useful, not that, and I want to be clear about this, not that climate change targets Jews primarily. It clearly doesn't, for all the reasons you talked about earlier. It targets everyone. And as of now, it's disproportionately impacting marginalized communities that are under-resourced and that are Black and brown, including many Jews of color. But if we approached climate change through a lens we do use a lot in Jewish life, which connects to that continuity thing, if we were to say, what is anti-Semitism? Well, anti-Semitism is, there's a lot of ways to define it, but roughly, I think that we'd all agree that something in the world that causes a deep amount of harm to large communities of Jews might be understood as anti-Semitism. Could we ask if we saw climate change as anti-Semitism, would we act as Jews more effectively on it? If we were like, oh, there's people who hate Jews, and there's also climate change, which could wipe out all of human existence and most inhabitation of the planet. The ultimate intersectional move would be to say, we're people. Jews are people too. I say that a lot. It's a useful reminder to me sometimes. But might we benefit from thinking about climate change not necessarily as anti-Semitism, but through the sort of muscles we like to use around anti-Semitism, which tend to spur us quickly into action as institutions, as communities, as individuals, in a way that somehow we don't get ourselves to do on issues that are quote unquote secular or not just Jewish. We seem to think that what it is to do Jewish work, quote unquote, is to focus on stuff that specifically is about Jews and not others. And that's why I think we're still not quite there on climate change, in addition to many other issues that don't just affect Jews. Is this making some amount of sense? Would you push back? How might we think about climate change through those muscles of urgency that we flex a lot in the face of anti-Semitism?
I think you said it very well, Lex. Anti-Semitism is about a lot of things. At its core, it's about the survival and flourishing of Jews, fighting anti-Semitism, I should say. And this, as you said, is about the survival and flourishing of all people, which includes Jews. This question is raised around a lot of social justice issues and often framed as, how do we do this Jewishly? how do we confront hunger as Jews? And I think that there's a lot of reasons why the Jewish community and Jews should confront hunger as Jews. A lot of reasons why we should engage in Jewish justice work. I think that that is, I don't know, magnified, doubled down on, prismed, I don't know what the verb is, for the climate crisis, right? It is the existential issue upon which all of life depends. It intersects. I challenge you to identify a social issue that does not intersect with the climate crisis. It is the ultimate intersectional issue. And my hope is that the Jewish community can, and I think it's starting to happen. Sadly, I think it's starting to happen because the impacts of the climate crisis are hitting closer and closer and closer. And it's becoming impossible for the Jewish community to act as though this is not a Jewish issue. So I think it's happening. I think it's happening too slowly. Again, I go back to this, like, we're too small in our own eyes. It's like this paradox of like having an overinflated sense of ourselves and also an under-acknowledged sense of our power. We could probably, I'm sure there are many dissertations written about why Jews might have a complex, paradoxical relationship to power. I think in this case, we fall into that at our peril, because this is a moment where we need to recognize the stakes and not be too small in our own eyes, and not just circle the wagons and bring our families onto the boats, to use Noah. This is not a time to just build higher walls or, figure out how to just protect our sanctuaries, literally or figuratively. This is a collective challenge, and it is going to require collective action.
I still don't know if this is parody or actually a good idea, but I'm just imagining in my head taking any given letter. You don't have to answer this, Jennie. Any given letter from the ADL or AIPAC or Hillel International or the Federation, with all this alarmist stuff about anti-Semitism, and just replacing it with, and to give money to Dayenu because, actually a lot more Jewish buildings are going to be destroyed, or a lot more Jews are going to be injured by these stalking horses, this huge flood that's going to sweep through California. Or it's just, when I think about it, it's just like the scale of destruction that is going to come about through this anti-Semite is a lot worse than the scale of destruction that is going to come around the ones that are, raising bazillions of dollars all the time with the most alarmist of language, and here we're talking about actually something alarming, existentially alarming, and not only to us but to everyone, and it's just kind of like another, experienced by some of the powers that be as just some more noise, some more quote social justice in a kind of, well, that just goes into the social justice bucket of our work, as opposed to, and so it's just, I just noting that for the record. I wanted to ask you, though, about the sort of movement building strategies, because, for example, what's been jumping out, you've mentioned it a few times, the Dayenu circles. I'm wondering, how does one go about building a movement for an area of work that has not been a major area of work in this community before? And what are the building blocks that go into, the strategy of how do we go from, sort of a quiet little amount of things and a lot of anxiety to a movement with real force? What does that look like?
So Dayenu circles are our grassroots mobilizing effort. These are small groups of folks who come together. It can be a core team of 5, 10, 15, 20 people who come together to take action on climate. Some are based in synagogues and hillels. We have some based in neighborhoods, come together to take action on climate, engage in Dayenu's campaigns. We provide resources and training and network to other Dayenu circles so that we're really creating, you can see the map on our website of the Dayenu circles across the country. And at key moments around the campaigns that I've mentioned, Hear the Call and Chutzpah 2020 and now Chutzpah 2022 and All Our Might campaign, come together to take action on national campaigns. And in many cases, they're also taking action and acting locally. So we brought together a lot of the Dayenu circles in California together with other partner organizations in the Jewish and beyond community to take action on California policy. Another building block are partnerships with organizations. Jewish organizations, secular organizations, multi-faith organizations, we're building a multi-generational Jewish climate movement. And multi-generational is one of these things that you think like, of course, multi-generational. There are very few. I challenge you, because if we were looking for models, so it's a challenge I would love to have good answers to, of movements and organizations that are multi-generational, truly multi-generational. It's hard. And we're in a moment of a lot of generational divides. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. But the climate crisis, and particularly the Jewish climate movement, it's so fundamental that it be multi-generational, both from a power building, movement building perspective and what different generations have to offer and have to bring. And because at its core, this is a crisis of whether and how we're going to live generation to generation, Vador Vador. Young Jews do not need to be convinced that this is the existential issue of our time and have a lot to be teaching and bringing to the movement, as do older activists who have a lot of experience and have, I think, their own sense of, I think a lot of older folks feel scared, some feel guilty, they feel sad. They also will not be here to bear the worst brunt of the climate crisis. I think younger Jews and younger folks, there's a lot of despair, there's anger, and there's also some of the most powerful activism and creativity coming there. Gen X, my own generation, I think that we are also experiencing that the world is not as we thought it was. The assumptions that we came of age with, that you keep working and things get better and better, there have been some fundamental understandings challenged. And there's some sense of loss and realignment and adjustment that we're experiencing. But we need all the generations just as we need all the communities.
So sometimes when I'm doing a Jewish learning session of one sort or another, a Torah study, whatever, I ask people to do a particular thing. And what it basically amounts to is it's amazing how much of our decision-making as individual Jews and as Jewish communities and as Jewish institutions, it's amazing how much of it sometimes boils down to what we think our ancestors would have wanted. We need to preserve X, Y, or Z text, or X, Y, or Z ritual, or X, Y, or Z holiday, or X, Y, or Z whatever, because it was important to our ancestors. And that's actually a really deep, important thing. Like I have literal Judaica from my family that dates back, 100 years. And like, if I were to lose that, I would feel terrible. Like I want to preserve that. I want to preserve what my ancestors literally, and by the way, I don't just mean people whose like literal ancestors were Jewish. I'm including like Jews by choice and like our ancestors in the broad, not genealogical sense. For every instance of, oh my gosh, my bubby would be rolling over in her grave, we don't have a mere image of that where we say, oh my gosh, my descendants in 200 years would totally lose their shit if we didn't act. Oh my gosh, my descendants, if I didn't act for climate change, first off, they wouldn't exist. Second off, they would feel malserved by us. And so when I'm teaching, I sometimes ask people, because we have images in our heads of our predecessors, I ask people to like envision Judaism of the future, whether it's literal descendants or just like Judaism of the future. And like, how could we act with them in mind as much as we act with our Jewish forebears, ancestors in mind? Climate justice work you talked about how it needs to be multi-generational today, but there's a way in which it's multi-general across time because it's the only way that we will have any future generations. So if we were working through that framework of multi-generational Jewish community, not just in our current time, but into the future, are there resources, ideas that Dayenu plays with along those lines that we could mobilize in the different communities that all our listeners are located in?
Yes. We have an exercise based on one of the founding mothers of spiritual work around the climate crisis is Joanna Macy. And she has a beautiful exercise, which we do in our workshops, in which future generations speak with their ancestors, who are us. It's hard to imagine something more profoundly Jewish than us being the ancestors speaking to future generations. And they describe to each other what life is like. And it enables us to cross time to imagine that we are in the future and what would have been done by us in order to ensure that future, which we don't only pray will be just and livable and sustainable, but that we work every day to try to bring about.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
It's been great to be here with both of you. Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We definitely encourage you to head to Dayenu.org to learn more about their work, see if there's a circle in your community that you can join, and in general, hop aboard that collective action that we all need to fight the climate crisis together. So we also want to encourage you on our front to stay tuned for some really great opportunities, including that right now we are in Elul, the 12th month, final month of the Jewish calendar year, the last one right before the high holidays. And that means that we are experiencing Elul Unbound, our annual journey through that month to prepare for the high holidays and be a little introspective and try out some different rituals and practices and whatever. It's super great. And we're having weekly Zoom gatherings on Fridays that you can sign up for at judaismunbound.com/Elul. And last but not least, Dan mentioned this at the top, but I'm going to mention it again. We have the most awesome On Yeshiva mini courses that are being offered. 3-week classes that you can take that you will super enjoy and learn from. We have details about them at judaismunbound.com/classes. And you can sign up now, but you can't sign up for much longer. Registration closes soon because the classes start soon. As this episode is being released on September 2nd, the classes start next week. If you're listening to this even later than September 2nd, they might be starting within a day or two. So really go and sign up. Registration is sliding scale. We want it to be accessible to everyone, and there's financial aid. So head to judaismunbound.com/classes. So the last thing we'll say is that we deeply appreciate being in touch with you. You can head to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And you can always email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We also are greatly appreciative if you're able to financially support us in any way, which you can do via judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you all so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. 23 more days of Shemitah.